The phone hit the tile and shattered, and for a heartbeat the entire corridor went silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The voice on the other end had been calm, precise, and utterly dismissive. "You have 10 minutes to clear your locker. Security will escort you out." The line went dead. Mary Collins stood under the fluorescent lights, breath-shallow palms, slick, staring at the cracked screen like it might explain what just happened. It was after midnight, the hour when Harrington Industries felt hollow and watchful. The long hallway smelled of disinfectant and old carpet glue. A janitor's cart sat crooked against the wall, one wheel squeaking softly every time the air system cycled on. Mary Bent picked up the phone and slid it into her pocket with a hand that would not stop shaking. 10 minutes. No reason, no hearing, no second chance. A security guard rounded the corner, Boots' heavy radio hissing at his shoulder. He did not look at her face. He looked at the badge clipped to her shirt. "Ma'am?" He said polite, but finished already thinking about the next thing. Mary nodded, swallowed, and started walking. The elevator doors closed with a dull thud. The mirror inside showed a woman in her mid-30s, hair pulled back too tight, eyes red from the chemical bite of cleaner. She watched her own reflection and felt the old urge rise, the one she had trained into her bones. Don't speak. Don't ask. Don't make it worse. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth until it ached. The doors opened on the locker room. Metal clanged. Someone laughed somewhere far away. Mary opened her locker and took out a folded sweater, a lunch container, a photograph she kept taped to the inside wall. Her brother's smile was crooked in the picture taken before the accident, before the cane, before the years of pain that never quite slept. She peeled the tape free and slid the photo into her pocket. The guard checked his watch. 2 minutes. Ooh. Mary closed the locker and turned the key. The click echoed. She handed the key over. The guard nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. As she walked, her eyes caught a sliver of glass down the hall, the executive corridor with its carpet thick enough to swallow sound. For a second, she saw again the thing she had tried to forget. The conference room door ajar, the flicker of a wrist under a suit sleeve, the soft, electronic chirp as a camera reset itself. She felt the memory land in her chest like a weight. Outside, Cleveland was wet and cold. Rain stitched the streetlights into long, trembling lines. Mary pulled her coat tight and stood under the awning, breathing in the damp metal smell of the city. She had no insurance, no savings to speak of, rent due in less than a week. The thought did not explode. It pressed steady and relentless. Across the street, a diner glowed, the kind with bad coffee and no questions. Mary crossed and slid into a booth. The vinyl squeaked. Vinyl. A waitress set down a mug without asking. Mary wrapped her hands around it and let the heat bite back. At the counter, 2 men talked low suits, rumpled voices tight. Boards spooked, one said. Plant in Indiana missed targets. Someone's pushing a rewrite. The other shook his head. You don't rewrite safety, not unless you want bodies. They went quiet when Mary looked up. She looked away first. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Are you safe? She stared at the words. Another followed. This is Evelyn Brooks, building security. We should talk. Not tonight. Mary exhaled slow. Evelyn. She pictured the older woman at the front desk, silver hair in a bun crossword, half-finished, eyes that noticed everything. Mary typed back with her thumbs. I'm fine. I don't work there anymore. A pause. Then the reply came. I know. Across town, in an office with a view of the river, Richard Harrington stood alone and watched the rain stripe the glass. He was 60, shoulders squared by habit tie loosened, but not removed. On his desk lay a stack of reports, edges aligned, corners clean. He read the same paragraph again, then again, jaw tightening. The numbers did not match. They never did when the truth was being bent. A knock. He did not turn. "Come in." Thomas Reed stepped inside, coat draped over his arm, smile set just right. "Long night," he said. He set the coat down carefully. "We're getting heat from the board. They want certainty." Richard faced him. His eyes were gray and steady. "Certainty comes from facts." Thomas spread his hands. "Facts come from people. People make mistakes." His gaze flicked just for a breath to the file on Richard's desk. "We found a breach. Low level. Contract cleaner. It's handled." Richard felt something cold slide behind his ribs. "Handled how?" "Separated," Thomas said. "Cleanly. No publicity." The word landed wrong. Richard nodded once. "Leave the file." Thomas hesitated, then slid it forward. As he turned to go, he paused. "We protect the company," he said. "That's what matters." After he left, Richard opened the file. Mary Collins, 36. Night shift. Contracted. He read the interview notes thin and careful, the way notes get when people are afraid to write too much. He closed the file and stared at his reflection in the glass. He thought of his sister's handwriting, small and exact, the way she wrote reports no one wanted to read. He picked up the phone and dialed security. "Evelyn," he said when she answered. "I need everything you have. Not the summary. Everything." Back at the diner, Mary pushed the mug away. The coffee had gone cold. She stood, paid cash, and stepped back into the rain. Her apartment was 3 flights up the stairs, creaking like they always did. Inside, the radiator hissed. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet come. The urge to call her brother flared and died. She would not add this to his load. She lay back and stared at the ceiling. 10 minutes! The words beat time in her head. 10 minutes to disappear. She closed her eyes and saw the reset light blink again, saw the hand pull back from the camera like it had been burned. Her pulse picked up. She rolled to her side and pressed her face into the pillow until the smell of detergent filled her lungs. In the early hours before the sky softened, Mary dreamed of alarms she could not hear. She woke with her heart racing and the taste of metal in her mouth. Her phone buzzed again. "Evelyn. Coffee tomorrow. 8 sharp. Don't be late." Mary sat up. The room felt smaller. She swung her feet to the floor and stood. In the mirror, her eyes looked different, not braver, clearer. Across the river, Richard Harrington did not sleep. He sat at his desk and read raw logs, lines of time-stamped text marching across the screen. A reset at 12:41 in the morning, another at 12:43, a badge swipe that did not belong. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Somewhere in the building, a woman had been told to clear her locker. He accepted that she quit. He did not accept losing her. The sun crept up over Cleveland, pale and stubborn. Mary pulled on her coat and stepped into the day with nothing certain except the weight in her pocket and the feeling that the story was larger than her fear, larger than one hallway and a broken phone. The city moved around her, indifferent and alive, and somewhere unseen a door was already opening. Mary was already awake when the diner door chimed at 8 sharp, her coat still damp at the cuffs, her hands folded around a cup she hadn't touched. The place smelled like burnt toast and old grease, the kind of smell that never leaves your clothes. She chose a booth with her back to the wall. Habit. When Evelyn Brooks walked in, she didn't wave. She didn't smile. She scanned the room. First eyes slow practiced, then slid into the seat across from Mary like she had been doing it for decades. "You look thinner," Evelyn said, setting her purse down carefully, both hands on the strap. Her voice was calm, almost flat, but her eyes lingered on Mary's face. "I lost my job," Mary said. It came out simple, stripped of drama. Saying it felt like pressing on a bruise. Evelyn nodded once. "I know." She signaled the waitress with 2 fingers. Coffee, black, and toast. She turned back to Mary. They moved fast. Mary watched the steam curl from Evelyn's mug when it arrived. She waited. Silence was Evelyn's language. Finally, Evelyn leaned in just enough to lower her voice. "I've been in that building since before the last recession," she said. "I've watched men walk out with boxes and women walk out with nothing but their purses. What happened to you wasn't clean." Mary's jaw tightened. "They said there was a breach." "There was," Evelyn said, "just not yours." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope, thick worn at the edges. She didn't slide it across. She kept it close. "I'm not giving you anything today. Not yet." Mary's pulse jumped. "Then why am I here?" "Because you quit," Evelyn said. "Because once you walked out, the company stopped owning your silence." She sipped her coffee. "And because you saw something they didn't expect you to see." Mary looked down at the table, the scratches carved into the wood by 1,000 restless hands. She saw again the camera light blink the wrist with the heavy watch, the way the door closed too softly. "I don't have proof," she said. "Just a moment." Evelyn's mouth curved, not a smile. Moments matter, especially when they don't fit. She straightened. "Listen carefully. I can't be the one to bring this inside. I still work there. I still have a badge. You don't. That's why they pushed you out first." Mary felt the weight of the words settle. "So what do you want from me?" "Patience," Evelyn said. "And distance. Let them think you're gone." Across town, the executive floor hummed with controlled urgency. Thomas Reed stood at the window phone pressed to his ear, his reflection a sharp cut against the gray sky. "We need stability," he said. "No leaks, no noise." He listened, jaw set, then softened his tone. "I understand the board's concern. I'm handling it." He ended the call and turned as the door opened. Richard Harrington stepped in without knocking. He didn't sit. He looked at the framed photos on the wall, the awards, the careful curation of success. Why was a contract cleaner escorted out without a formal review? He asked. Thomas exhaled slow. Because time matters. Because perception matters. We can't afford a story. Richard's eyes didn't move. Stories grow when facts are buried. Thomas held his gaze. Facts grow when you give them oxygen. He paused. We protected the company. The word again. Richard nodded once. Leave the logs on my desk by noon. Thomas hesitated just a fraction. The raw feeds are messy. I like messy, Richard said. He turned and left. By noon, Mary was back in her apartment, the envelope from Evelyn heavy in her mind, though it wasn't in her hands. She sat at the small table and spread out her bills, rent, utilities, the prescription her brother needed every month. The numbers stared back unkind. She pressed her fingers to her temples and breathed through the tightness. This was the part she had tried to avoid all her life. The part where doing the right thing costs you something you can't replace. Her phone rang. Her brother's name lit the screen. She answered on the second ring. Hey, you okay? He asked. He always knew. I'm managing, she said. She pictured his kitchen, the window over the sink, the way he leaned on the counter when the pain flared. How's the leg? He laughed short. Same as yesterday. Better than tomorrow. He paused. You sound tired. Mary closed her eyes. I'll call you later. After she hung up, she sat very still. The urge to go quiet rose again, thick and familiar. She stood and opened the window instead. Cold air rushed in sharp, honest. She let it sting. At the building, Evelyn watched the afternoon unfold from behind the security desk. People passed with purpose eyes on their phones, their screens reflecting futures they believed were guaranteed. She logged a routine entry and glanced at the monitor. No one checked anymore. The environmental feed flickered dull and constant. She watched the timestamps roll. She waited. At 4, a man in a suit she had never liked walked by and didn't look at her. She noted the way his hand hovered near his pocket, the way his shoulders were too tight. She made a mark on a pad and slid it into a drawer. By evening, Thomas Reed sat with counsel voices, low, words chosen carefully. "We should offer severance," the lawyer said. "Quiet money." Thomas shook his head. "She refused already." "Then she's dangerous," the lawyer said. "No," Thomas replied. "She's broke." At dusk, Mary walked the neighborhood to keep from thinking. The sky went pink, then gray. She passed a church with the doors open, light spilling out the sound of a piano, practicing the same hymn again and again. She stopped and listened. The melody pulled at something old. She moved on. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Evelyn. "Tomorrow. Same place. Bring nothing." Night came. Richard Harrington sat at his desk and watched the raw logs load. Lines of data stacked imperfect human. He traced the resets, the access points, the timing that didn't make sense. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. In the quiet, he remembered a voice from years ago, measured, patient. "This is not safe." He had not listened then. He would not repeat it now. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had not used in years. "I need an external audit," he said when the voice answered. "Quiet. Independent. Start with Indiana." In the early morning, Mary lay awake and stared at the ceiling again. But this time the silence felt different. It pressed yes, but it also waited. She rolled onto her side and breathed slow. Somewhere in the city, gears were turning. She didn't know if they would grind her down or lift her up. She only knew she would not close her eyes and pretend not to hear them. The knock came just after 7, 3 firm taps that carried through the thin walls like a decision already made. Mary stood in the narrow hallway listening to her own breath, then opened the door. 2 people stood there, neither smiling. One wore a charcoal coat and held a leather folio. The other carried himself like he belonged anywhere he chose to stand. "Mary Collins," the woman said. "I'm Susan Hale. This is Mark Alvarez. We're with an independent firm retained to conduct a safety and compliance audit." Mary did not step aside at first. By who, she asked. Susan met her eyes. "By the company you no longer work for." Mary felt the floor tilt a fraction. She stepped back and let them in. The apartment smelled of detergent and toast. Mark glanced once at the bills on the table, then at the photograph by the sink, the brother with the crooked smile. He looked away. "We won't be long," Susan said. "And you're not in trouble." Mary folded her arms. "That's usually how it starts." Susan opened the folio, careful, deliberate. "We want your account. From the beginning. In your own words." Mary sat. She placed her hands flat on the table and began. She spoke about the night, the hallway, the reset light, the watch. She spoke about the interview, the transfer, the hours cut. She spoke about the phone call that ended her job. She did not speculate. She did not accuse. She stayed with what she knew. When she finished, the room felt smaller. Mark asked, "Did anyone tell you to stay quiet?" "No," Mary said. "They didn't have to." Susan nodded and closed the folio. "Thank you." She stood. "If you remember anything else, call me." At the door, Mark paused. "You did the right thing," he said, and then he was gone. Across the city, Thomas Reed sat in a glass conference room with 3 men who all wore the same expression. One leaned back, fingers steepled. "The auditors are on site," he said. Thomas's smile held. "Good. Transparency." Another man tapped a pen. "They're talking to former staff." Thomas shrugged. "They should." The third man's eyes narrowed, including the cleaner. Thomas's smile thinned. Contractor. The pen stopped tapping. By noon, the building buzzed with rumor. On the executive floor, doors closed more often than usual. On the factory floor in Indiana, a supervisor told a crew to take an early lunch and said nothing else. Men and women washed their hands and watched the clock. Evelyn Brooks sat at the security desk and filled out a form she had filled out 1,000 times. Her handwriting was steady. When the auditors walked past, she did not look up. She waited until the corridor cleared, then reached into a drawer and removed the envelope she had shown Mary. She did not open it. She simply held it for a moment, feeling the weight of paper and time. At 2, Richard Harrington called her office phone. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, sir." "Do you trust the system that doesn't talk to the system?" he asked. Evelyn allowed herself a breath. "Yes." "Then bring it to my office," Richard said. "Now." She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked. The elevator ride felt longer than it ever had. When the doors opened, Richard was waiting. He took the envelope and did not sit. He opened it and read without expression. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the building doing what it always did. "This puts dates to questions," Richard said finally. Evelyn nodded. "It puts people in places they said they weren't." "Thank you," Richard said. He did not add anything else. He did not need to. That evening, Mary walked to the church again. The doors were open. She slipped into the back pew and sat. The hymn had stopped. The piano rested. A woman near the front bowed her head and whispered a prayer Mary could not hear. Mary closed her eyes and let the quiet come. It did not judge her. It did not excuse her. It simply stayed. Her phone vibrated. A text from Susan Hale. "We may need you tomorrow. Be available." Mary typed back, "I will." At home, she found an envelope on the mat. No return address. Inside was a grocery card and a note in careful block letters. "For the week. Don't thank me." She sat on the floor and held the card like it might vanish. At the building, Thomas Reed's phone rang again. He stepped into his office and closed the door. "Yes," he said. "The Indiana plant," the voice said. "They're pulling samples. Old ones." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They can't. They already did." He hung up and stared at the wall. For the first time in years, he felt the edge of panic. He thought of the quarter, the targets, the promises he had made. He thought of the contractor with the quiet eyes. He reached for his phone and stopped. The next morning broke hard and bright. Cleveland looked scrubbed honest. Mary stood at her window and watched people go to work. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The air felt clean. At 9, Susan Hale met her in a neutral office downtown. "We're going to ask you to sit in," she said. "Not to speak unless asked." Mary nodded. In the room, the table was long and bare. On one side sat the auditors. On the other, company counsel. Richard Harrington entered last. He did not sit at the head. He sat with his hands folded, eyes forward. Thomas Reed arrived 5 minutes late. He took his seat and glanced at Mary, then away. Susan began. "We're here to establish a timeline." She laid it out. Dates, times, access points. The room stayed quiet as the pieces fell into place. When Susan finished, she looked at Mary. "Miss Collins," she said. "On the night in question, did you see Mr. Reed on the executive floor after hours?" Mary felt the weight of the room press in. She looked at Richard. He did not nod. He did not shake his head. He simply waited. "Yes," Mary said. Thomas leaned forward. "That's a lie." Susan raised a hand. "We have corroboration." Thomas's laugh was short. "From who?" "A desk clerk." Evelyn stood from the back of the room. Her voice did not shake. "From me," she said. The room shifted. Richard did not move. Susan continued, "We also have environmental logs and recovered correspondence." Thomas's face changed then. Not anger, calculation. He leaned back and folded his arms. So he said softly, "This is how it goes." Richard spoke at last. "This is how it should have gone." Silence followed, heavy and final. Mary sat and felt the slow, steady thud of her heart. She had spoken. The room had listened. Whatever came next, she would not pretend she hadn't heard the gears turning. The room emptied without ceremony, chairs scraping softly as people avoided eye contact, as if the air itself might remember who stood where. Mary remained seated until her legs stopped trembling. When she finally rose, the weight in her chest did not lift, but it steadied like a storm settling into a hard rain. In the corridor, Susan Hale caught up to her. "You did exactly what we asked," she said. "Nothing more." Mary nodded. Her throat felt raw. "What happens now?" "Process," Susan replied. "And time. Time." Mary stepped outside into a wind that cut clean through her coat. Cleveland moved on. Buses hissed. A delivery truck honked, once impatient. She walked until the building fell behind her, and the ache in her calves gave her something solid to hold on to. Inside Harrington Industries, Thomas Reed closed his office door and stood very still. The glass walls reflected his face back at him, older than he remembered, lines drawn deeper by the day. He loosened his tie and stared at the phone on his desk. It did not ring. He reached for a legal pad and wrote a list of names, then drew a line through 2 of them. He folded the page and placed it in his pocket. The building hummed indifferent. Richard Harrington returned to his office and sat without turning on the lights. He listened to the city and to the quieter sound beneath it, the machinery of decisions long delayed. He picked up his sister's old notebook from a drawer he rarely opened. The spine was cracked. The handwriting inside was neat and patient. He closed it and rested his hand on the cover until the impulse to act burned steady instead of sharp. By late afternoon, an email went out to senior leadership. External audit ongoing. Full cooperation required. Any interference will be considered grounds for termination. The words were plain. The effect was not. At the security desk, Evelyn Brooks watched the faces pass. Some nodded at her now. Some did not. She marked the times, the entries, the exits. She felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. When her shift ended, she placed her badge on the counter and took a breath before clipping it back on. Not yet, she told herself. Not until it's done. Mary returned home to an apartment that felt quieter than usual. She made soup from a can and ate standing up. Her phone buzzed. Her brother again. She answered and listened to him talk about the weather, the ache in his leg, the neighbor's dog. She told him she might be busy tomorrow. She did not tell him why. He did not ask. That night she slept and dreamed of hallways that led somewhere else. The next morning brought a letter slid under her door. Official letterhead. A request to appear again, this time with counsel present if she wished. She sat at the table and read it twice. Counsel meant money. Money meant calling someone she hadn't wanted to call. She dialed a number from memory. "Dad," she said, when the voice answered. The silence on the other end held years in it. "I need advice." At the building, the auditors pulled files and traced routes. In Indiana, production slowed as machines were tested and retested. A supervisor told a crew they were doing the right thing. A man with gray at his temples nodded and said he'd heard that before. Thomas Reed met with his lawyer in a small office away from glass. "They're building a narrative," the lawyer said. "You need to decide if you're fighting or settling." Thomas's mouth tightened. "There's nothing to settle." The lawyer watched him carefully. "That confidence," he said, "can be expensive." By midweek, the board convened in a room that smelled of coffee and old wood. Richard stood and spoke without notes. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer reassurance. He spoke about responsibility and about the cost of being wrong. When he finished, there were no questions. Mary arrived downtown with her father an hour later, a man who moved slowly and listened hard. He did not say much in the waiting area. He placed a hand on her shoulder once and left it there until she breathed easier. In the room, the questions came measured and fair. Mary answered the same way she always had. She did not argue. She did not plead. When it was over, Susan Hale shook her hand. "We'll be in touch." Outside, her father said, "You did right. It was not approval. It was acknowledgement." By Friday, the news broke quietly. COO placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Markets dipped and recovered. Commentators speculated. Mary watched none of it. She cleaned her apartment and walked the neighborhood. She went to the diner and drank coffee she could taste again. On Sunday, the knock came in the late afternoon softer than before. Mary opened the door and found Richard Harrington standing in the hall, coat in hand, no entourage, no folder. He looked tired. He looked human. "I accepted your quitting," he said, not unkindly, "but I didn't accept losing you." Mary did not step aside. "I don't work for you." "No," Richard said. "You don't." He held her gaze. "That's why I'm here." She waited. "I'm asking you to consult," he continued. "Temporary. Independent. We need someone who sees what others miss and says it out loud." He paused. "There will be pay. There will be support. There will be a path if you want one." Mary felt the old urge to retreat. She felt the newer one steadier. "I don't want a title," she said. "Good," Richard replied. "Neither do I. I want outcomes." She looked past him at the stairwell, the chipped paint, the smell of boiled cabbage from a neighbor's door. "I'll think about it." Richard nodded. "Take the time you need." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Mary closed the door and leaned against it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn. "It's almost done." Mary smiled small and real and went to make coffee. Mary did not answer Richard Harrington that night. She made coffee and let it go cold on the counter while the building settled around her pipes, ticking, a neighbor's television murmuring through the wall. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around the mug and stared at the steam thinning into nothing. Outcomes, he had said, not titles. She had learned the price of words that sounded clean. Morning came gray and steady. She walked to the grocery store with the card still in her pocket, bought eggs and bread, counted the bills twice. At the register, the clerk smiled and asked how her day was going. Mary said, "All right," and meant something like it. Outside, a man held a door open for her. She thanked him. The city kept doing its small, decent things. At 10, Susan Hale called. "We're finalizing scope," she said. "If you choose to consult, you'll be insulated. Independence matters." Mary watched a bus pull away, exhaust hanging low. "From who?" "From everyone," Susan replied, "including him." Mary nodded, even though Susan could not see it. "Send me the terms." At Harrington Industries, the executive floor felt different, quieter, sharper. Doors stayed open now, as if to prove something. Richard walked past offices and met eyes that did not look away. He stopped at the window and watched the river push through ice. He thought of Mary's hallway, the chipped paint, the stairwell that smelled like boiled cabbage. He knew the company had been built by people like that and run by people who forgot. Thomas Reed sat at home and stared at his phone. Messages from colleagues came carefully, then not at all. His lawyer called and left a voicemail that did not promise anything. Thomas poured a drink he did not want and did not finish it. He paced. He rehearsed explanations. He told himself the numbers justified the risk. He told himself everyone did it. He did not call his wife. Evelyn Brooks worked her shift and trained the new guard, slowly repeating procedures she had once rushed through. "You watch patterns," she said, "not people." The guard nodded and tried to look older than he was. At lunch, Evelyn ate half a sandwich and folded the rest away. She felt the pull of retirement and resisted it. Not yet. Mary read the consulting terms twice. Pay per hour. Defined scope. No authority over personnel. Direct access to audit findings. No non-disclosure beyond what was already public. She set the paper down and stood. She paced her apartment, touched the photograph by the sink, thought of her brother's kitchen, and the way he leaned on the counter when pain flared. She dialed his number. "Hey," he said. "I might take some work," Mary said. "Short term." "Good," he replied. "You always were better when you were busy." He paused. "Is it the place?" "Yes." He did not tell her to be careful. He told her to call if she needed a ride. That afternoon, Mary emailed Susan one line. "I'm in. Independent only." Susan replied with a time and a location that was not the building. They met in a neutral office with bare walls and a table scarred by use. Two auditors sat with laptops open. Mary took a chair and set her bag at her feet. She listened as they outlined the next steps. Sampling. Verification. Worker interviews. She spoke when asked. She spoke plainly. She asked questions that slowed the room and tightened it. The auditors nodded and wrote more. Across the river, Richard signed off on a memo that expanded the audit to include subcontractors. The board chair called and warned him about optics. Richard listened and said he understood. He hung up and did not change the memo. The Indiana plant ran on reduced speed. A man named Frank, with 30 years on the line, watched a gauge and shook his head. "We told them," he said to no one. A younger worker asked what he meant. Frank shrugged. "You'll learn." Mary flew out on a late afternoon flight window seat, notebook open. The clouds bruised purple at sunset. She landed and rented a compact car that smelled like cleaner and plastic. At the motel, she lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan. She thought of the watch. She had seen the weight of it, the way expensive things announced themselves without speaking. The plant tour was loud and bright. Hard hats, vests. A supervisor walked them through with rehearsed ease. Mary lagged, watching hands, listening to the rhythm of machines. She noticed a guardrail bolted with mismatched hardware, a warning label faded to illegibility. She asked a question. The supervisor answered too fast. She wrote it down. At lunch, she sat with workers at a long table. They eyed her badge and said nothing until she took it off and set it aside. "I used to clean the executive floor," she said. A man laughed once. Another nodded. They talked. They talked about near misses and shortcuts that became habits. Mary listened. She did not promise anything. That night she called Evelyn. "You still have the old manuals," Mary said. Evelyn did not hesitate. Always. Back in Cleveland, Thomas Reed read an article that mentioned his name and used the word alleged. He threw the paper away and then fished it out of the trash. He underlined a sentence and called his lawyer. "We counter," he said. The lawyer was quiet. "With what?" Thomas looked at the wall and said nothing. Mary returned home 2 days later with a notebook full of details and a fatigue that sat deep in her bones. She slept. She woke and typed until her wrists hurt. She sent questions to Susan and copied Richard without comment. He replied once. Received. On Friday evening, Richard stood again in Mary's hallway, this time with a thin folder. "No pressure," he said, holding it out. "Feedback." She took it and did not open it. "I don't want this to become a symbol," she said. "Symbols get used." "I know," he replied. "That's why it won't be." She studied him. The rain had started again, soft and persistent. "Then we keep it boring," she said. Richard allowed himself a small smile. Boring saves lives. They stood there a moment longer, neither rushing. When he left, Mary opened the folder. Inside were timelines, revised budgets, reallocated, a note in the margin written in a steady hand. Approved. Proceed. Mary sat at her table and felt the weight shift, not lift. She made coffee and drank it hot this time. Outside, the city kept moving. Somewhere gears turned in a different direction. The hearing room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper, a civic smell that belonged to mornings and rules. Mary sat at the narrow table with her notebook closed, hands folded, shoulders squared. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. When it reached 10, the door opened and the panel filed in faces, practiced expressions neutral. No one smiled. That helped. Susan Hale took the seat beside her and murmured, "Answer only what's asked." Mary nodded. She had learned restraint the hard way. Across the aisle, Thomas Reed entered with counsel suit, immaculate posture, relaxed in the way of a man who believed the room would bend to him. He did not look at Mary. He adjusted his cuff and sat. The chair cleared his throat. "We're here to consider findings related to operational safety and executive conduct." His eyes moved from one side to the other. "This is not a trial. It is a record." A record. Mary felt the word settle. Records outlasted people. The questions began with process and moved to specifics. Dates, access, authority. Mary spoke when addressed, her voice steady, her answers clean. She described the guardrail, the faded label, the reset light. She named nothing she could not support. When asked how she knew, she spoke about patterns, about habit, about listening. Thomas's counsel objected once. The chair waved him down. "This is a record," he repeated. When Thomas spoke, his voice was smooth. He framed decisions as trade-offs. He used words like mitigation and optimization. He referenced targets and markets and the pressure of quarterlies. He never said risk. He said acceptable exposure. Mary watched his hands. They did not shake. That told her more than his words. At 11:30, the chair asked a final question. If the proposed revisions had been adopted, would the probability of serious injury have increased? Mary answered without looking at Thomas. "Yes." "By how much?" Mary paused. She saw the plant floor again, the mismatched bolts, the faded warning. She chose her words. "Enough to matter." The chair nodded. "That's sufficient." Outside, the hallway filled with voices that fell when Mary passed. Susan squeezed her elbow once and let go. "You did well," she said. Mary stepped into the cold air and breathed. The sky was high and pale. She checked her phone. A message from Evelyn. "It's done here. Retirement paperwork submitted." Mary smiled quick and bright, then tucked the phone away. Across town, Richard Harrington stood before the board in a room with a long table and no windows. He did not sit. He spoke plainly about findings and timelines and consequences. When the board chair raised a concern about exposure, Richard met it and did not yield. "We exposed ourselves when we stopped listening," he said. "We limit damage by changing." There was silence, then a vote, then another. The board chair exhaled and nodded. "Proceed." Richard sat at last. He felt the old ache in his shoulder and welcomed it. Pain meant he was still present. By mid-afternoon, the press release went out. COO terminated for cause. Audit expanded. Safety protocols revised. The market dipped and steadied. The city moved on. Thomas Reed left his building with a box and a face that did not look back. A camera caught his profile. He raised a hand once as if to adjust his collar, and then it was over. Mary returned to the neutral office and debriefed with Susan and the auditors. They spoke about next steps and worker outreach, and the long tail of change. Mary asked for time at the plants without escorts. Susan agreed. At the Indiana plant, Mary stood on the line with Frank and watched the gauge settle where it should have been all along. Frank nodded once. "About time," he said. Mary nodded back. No speeches, just the hum of machines doing honest work. That evening, Mary visited her brother. He moved slow to the door and smiled when he saw her. She cooked while he sat at the table and told her about a neighbor who finally fixed a fence. She listened and chopped and felt something uncoil. "Are you staying?" he asked. "For now," she said. He studied her. "You look lighter?" She laughed. "I feel heavier, just steadier." Back in Cleveland, Richard sat at his desk and reviewed a draft charter titled "Speak Up for Safety." He crossed out a sentence that sounded like marketing and wrote another in his own hand. Anonymous means protected, always. He set the pen down and stared at the words until they felt true. The next morning, Mary walked into Harrington Industries through the side entrance badge, Temporary Access Limited. She passed the security desk where Evelyn's chair sat empty. A younger guard looked up. Mary nodded and moved on. In a conference room with scuffed chairs, Mary met with supervisors and union reps. She listened first. She took notes. When she spoke, she did not promise miracles. She promised process. She promised that silence would cost more than speech. A man in the back crossed his arms. "We've heard this before." Mary met his eyes. "I have too." The room shifted. At lunch, Richard joined them and sat without preamble. He listened. When a woman described a near miss from years back, he wrote it down himself. When someone asked what would happen if they spoke up, he answered. "You'll be protected," he said. "If you're not, it's on me." The words landed heavy and real. That night, Mary returned to her apartment and found a letter under the door. From the state, a notice acknowledging receipt of testimony, a process beginning. She placed it in a folder and set it on the shelf. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. "Thank you for today." She typed back. "Keep it boring." He replied a moment later. "That's the plan." Mary made tea and stood at the window. Rain traced the glass. The city glowed and breathed. She felt tired in the good way, the kind that followed honest work. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more rooms, more clocks ticking too loudly. She would answer. She would listen. She would keep the record straight. Outside, a bus hissed and pulled away. Somewhere, a machine shut down safely. Somewhere else, a worker went home without a story to tell, and that Mary thought was the point. The first lawsuit landed like a dull thud, not loud enough to startle the building, but heavy enough to be felt everywhere. Mary read the headline on her phone while standing in line at the pharmacy, the words careful and legal, the tone confident in its distance. Former executive disputes termination. Allegations contested. She paid for her brother's medication and folded the receipt into her pocket, the paper warm from her hand. At Harrington Industries, the atmosphere tightened. Not panicked. Focused. Lawyers moved through hallways with quiet shoes. Calendars filled. The work did not stop. It never did. That was the lesson Richard Harrington had learned. Early systems reveal their values under pressure. Mary arrived through the side entrance again, temporary badge clipped eyes forward. She passed a bulletin board newly pinned with notices about the reporting channel. Speak up, protected, anonymous. The words were clean. She knew they would be tested. In a small conference room, she met with supervisors from 3 plants and 2 union reps. Coffee cups lined the table like markers of endurance. A man with a scar along his forearm leaned back and crossed his arms. "So, what happens when someone lies?" he asked. Mary didn't answer right away. She looked around the table. "We investigate," she said. same as when someone tells the truth. The process doesn't change because the story does. The man nodded once, not convinced, but listening. That mattered. Later in Richard's office, the Blinds' half-drawn counsel laid out the strategy. Discovery will be aggressive, the lawyer said. They'll look for inconsistency. Richard glanced at Mary. There won't be any. Mary kept her eyes on the table. There will be fatigue, she said. That's where mistakes happen. Richard nodded. We plan for fatigue. Across town, Thomas Reed met with his own counsel in a room that smelled of old leather and ambition. They're painting me as reckless, he said. They're painting you as responsible for decisions, the lawyer replied. Thomas leaned forward. I protected the company. The lawyer did not argue. We'll focus on intent. Intent. The word felt thin even to Thomas. He thought of nights spent recalculating margins of calls that ended with promises he believed he could keep. He told himself the system had forced his hand. He did not tell himself about the watch, the reset, the small shortcuts that became normal. At the Indiana plant, Mary walked the floor with a clipboard and no entourage. Frank fell into step beside her. They're nervous, he said, nodding at a cluster of workers. They should be, Mary replied. Change feels like risk. Frank smiled small. You don't sound like management. Mary stopped by the guardrail and touched the bolt head with her glove. I don't want to, she said. That afternoon, a report came in through the new channel. Anonymous. A near miss from years ago. The details matched a maintenance log Mary had flagged. She forwarded it to Susan and copied Richard with a single line. Corroborates. Richard replied minutes later. Thank you. Mary felt the pull of the old pattern, the one that said, Stop here, you've done enough. She ignored it and kept reading. The press cycle spun. A morning show framed the story as a corporate reckoning. An afternoon panel called it a cautionary tale. By evening, another story took its place. Mary did not watch. She cooked for her brother and listened to him complain about the weather. On Thursday, Mary sat for a deposition. The room was windowless, the chair hard. The questions came sharp and circular. She answered the same way every time. When the opposing counsel tried to lead, she waited. When he pressed, she repeated herself. Time stretched. At the break, Susan handed her water. You're doing fine, she said. Mary nodded. Her jaw ached from holding steady. Back at the building, a supervisor pulled Richard aside. People are scared, he said. Richard looked at the man. Good, he replied. It means they care. That night, Mary walked home under a sky low with cloud. Her phone buzzed. Evelyn. How's the fight? Mary smiled and typed. Boring. Effective. Evelyn replied with a thumbs up she had learned late in life. The next week brought a small victory. The court denied an injunction Thomas's team had sought to halt the audit. The ruling was brief and firm. Mary read it twice, then set the phone down and breathed. At Harrington Industries, the work deepened. Training sessions filled rooms. Mary spoke less and listened more. When a worker hesitated at the mic, she waited until he found his words. When someone grew angry, she let it land. Anger, she had learned, was often fear asking to be seen. Richard attended one session and said nothing until the end. Then he stood and thanked them for their time. Not their honesty, their time. It mattered. It giwan. Thomas Reed watched the denial scroll across his screen and felt something crack. He poured another drink and left it untouched. He called an old colleague and heard the pause before the greeting. He hung up and stared at the wall. For the first time, he wondered what he would do if he lost. Mary received a call from her father. "Your mother saw you on the news," he said. Mary closed her eyes. "Did she?" "She said you looked like yourself," he replied. The words sat with her all afternoon. On Friday, a worker at the Indiana plant stopped Mary near the exit. "I used the channel," she said, voice low. "I didn't think anyone would call back." Mary met her eyes. They did. The woman nodded relief plain. "Thank you." Mary walked out into the late sun and felt the weight of the week settle and lift at once. That evening, Richard came by without notice. He did not stay long. "The board's nervous," he said. Mary poured coffee and handed him a mug. "They will be." "They asked about making this permanent," Richard added. Mary set her mug down. "Not yet." Richard watched her. "What do you need?" She thought of the bolt that gauged the faded label. "Time," she said. "And less noise." Richard nodded. "Done." After he left, Mary stood at the window and watched the city blink on. She felt the fatigue deep in her bones and the steadiness beneath it. The fight was not over. It might never be. But the record was being written in real time, line by line, and for once it was honest. Her phone buzzed with a final message for the night. From Susan. Discovery schedule attached. Mary smiled, set the phone face down, and made tea. Tomorrow would come with more questions. She would answer them. Winter tightened its grip overnight, turning the sidewalks into narrow channels of ice and grit. Mary walked carefully, breath fogging the air, her scarf pulled high. The city felt smaller in the cold, sounds, sharper choices closer. At the corner, a man slipped and laughed it off. She offered an arm. He took it grateful, and they parted without names. Inside Harrington Industries, the heating hummed and the work pressed on. Mary's badge still said temporary. She liked it that way. It reminded people to talk to her like a person, not a position. In a meeting room with chipped paint and too many chairs, she sat with a dozen supervisors and a union steward who kept his pen tucked behind his ear. The steward cleared his throat. "We've got buy-in," he said. "What we don't have is trust." Mary nodded. "Trust is slow," she said. "Process is faster. We start there." She laid out a pilot plan that felt deliberately unglamorous. Walk-downs every shift, 2 signatures for changes, a pause button anyone could hit, no rewards for speed. The room listened. A woman in a blue jacket raised her hand. "What happens when production misses targets?" Mary met her gaze. "We miss targets," she said. "We don't miss funerals." Silence followed, not awkward, just real. Across town, Thomas Reed's world narrowed to legal calendars and clipped phone calls. He sat in his kitchen and stared at a stack of mail he did not open. His phone buzzed. His lawyer. "Discovery's not going your way," the voice said. "There's correspondence." Thomas closed his eyes. "Context matters," he said. "It will," the lawyer replied. "To a jury." Thomas hung up and felt the weight settle. He thought of the plant floor, the heat, the noise, the men and women who made numbers into things. He had not walked it in years. He had told himself he didn't need to. Mary flew back to Indiana and stood again by the guardrail. This time, a maintenance crew worked beside her, torque wrenches clicking in steady rhythm. Frank watched and nodded. "Feels different," he said. "It is," Mary replied. She wrote nothing down. At lunch, a young worker asked, "Are they really protected?" Mary took off her badge and set it on the table. "I was escorted out in 10 minutes, she said. "That didn't stop me. Protection isn't perfect. It's practiced." The worker chewed and nodded, considering. That night, Mary returned to Cleveland and found an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a handwritten note from Evelyn. "Coffee tomorrow. Last one on me." Mary smiled and felt a tightness she hadn't expected. They met at the diner where it had started, the smell unchanged. Evelyn looked lighter without the badge. "I slept in," she said, pleased. Turns out I'm bad at it. Mary laughed. You earned it. Evelyn slid a folder across the table. For you, she said. Old incident reports, pre-digital. They don't fit anywhere else. Mary flipped through and felt the years in her hands. Why give them to me? Evelyn sipped her coffee. Because you'll read them. Back at the building, Richard Harrington walked the executive floor with counsel and stopped more often than before. He asked questions he had once delegated. He listened longer than felt efficient. When counsel suggested a messaging pivot, Richard shook his head. We're not pivoting, he said. We're fixing. In a board subcommittee meeting, a member raised an eyebrow. This is costing us. Richard did not argue. It already did, he said. The deposition calendar grew heavier. Mary sat again under lights that flattened everything and answered until her voice went hoarse. When opposing counsel tried to catch her on a phrase, she slowed. I don't recall, she said when she didn't. When she did, she said so and stopped. Susan nodded, approving. Between sessions, Mary took calls from workers. Small things. A lock that stuck. A checklist that confused. She forwarded and followed up. The work was granular and endless and right. The lawsuit edged closer to a hearing on summary judgment. Headlines sharpened. A columnist wrote about courage. Another wrote about overreach. Mary read neither. She cooked soup and labeled containers for her brother's freezer. He watched from a chair and teased her about seasoning. She fixed it, and they laughed. One afternoon, a supervisor called and said, We hit the pause. His voice shook. Production's behind. Mary closed her eyes and listened to the hum on the line. Why, she asked. A vibration, he said. Didn't like it. Good, Mary replied. Stay paused. The vibration turned into a hairline crack that would have become a failure. The report landed on Richard's desk with photos and timestamps. He wrote 2 words at the top. Thank you. The winter deepened. Mary walked slower and thought more. She found herself noticing faces in meetings, the way fear sat behind anger, the way relief softened shoulders. She learned which questions opened rooms and which closed them. Thomas Reed's counsel called again. There's an offer, he said. Quiet. Limited. Thomas stared at the wall. I didn't do anything wrong, he said. The lawyer was silent long enough to be honest. You did something, he said. The night before the hearing, Mary couldn't sleep. She stood at the window and watched snow fall in clean sheets. Her phone buzzed. Richard. Tomorrow will be long. Mary typed back, Long is fine. In the morning, the courthouse smelled like coffee and resolve. Mary sat with Susan and felt the weight of the day settle into place. When the judge entered the room, rose and fell. Arguments came crisp and controlled. Documents spoke. Timelines aligned. When it was done, the judge took the matter under advisement and set a date. Outside the cold bit. Mary pulled her coat tight and breathed. A reporter asked a question. Susan stepped in and said no comment. Back at the building, the pilot results came in. Incident rates down. Near misses reported up. The graph told a story Mary trusted. Richard forwarded it to the board with a note. This is working. That evening, Mary returned home and found Richard in the hallway again, coat dusted with snow. He didn't speak at first. He looked tired and resolved. The board wants permanence, he said. Mary leaned against the doorframe. And you. I want durability, Richard replied. With you. She considered the word. Durable meant slow and strong. It meant planning for weather. I'll say yes, she said finally. On conditions. Richard nodded. Name them. Independence, Mary said. Authority to stop work. Budget transparency. And a path for someone else to take this from me when it's time. Richard didn't hesitate. Agreed. Mary opened the door and stepped back. Then we do it, she said. Richard smiled, small and genuine. Then we do it. After he left, Mary set the folder from Evelyn on the table and opened it again. The pages smelled of dust and ink. She felt the past and the future touch and separate. Outside, snow kept falling quiet and relentless. Inside, the work waited patient and ready. The ruling came down on a Tuesday morning that felt ordinary enough to be dangerous. Mary was in the neutral office coat draped over the back of a chair notebook, open but untouched when Susan Hale's phone vibrated. Susan read once then again and set the phone face down like it might bite. Summary judgment denied, she said. Trial proceeds. The words landed without drama. No cheers, no collapse, just a shift in gravity. Mary nodded and closed her notebook. When? Spring. Susan replied. Sooner than they hoped. Across town, Thomas Reed watched the same words load on his screen and felt the room tilt. He stood paced, stopped. He imagined 12 faces in a box, imagined them watching footage of a plant floor he had not walked in years. He called his lawyer and left a message that asked a question he already knew the answer to. At Harrington Industries, Richard Harrington gathered the senior team and spoke for 5 minutes. He said what the ruling meant and what it did not. He said the work continued. He said the company would not posture. He dismissed them and stayed standing until the room emptied. Then he sat and wrote a note to himself in the margin of the charter. Stay boring. Mary returned to the building through the side entrance, temporary badge replaced at last with one that carried her name and a role that still felt heavier than it looked. Director Safety and Ethics. She did not linger on the words. She went straight to the boardroom where the pilot results were projected in clean lines. Incident severity down. Reporting up. Downtime contained. She pointed to the spike and explained why it was good news. The board listened. Some leaned forward. Some did not. The vote came later, measured and unanimous. Permanence approved. At lunch, Mary ate soup at her desk and answered emails from plants she had not visited yet. One message stood out: a supervisor in a small facility asking if the pause authority applied to contractors. Mary replied with a single sentence. Everyone. She copied Richard. He replied with a thumbs up he would have once avoided. In Indiana, Frank watched a training session end and shook his head. Never thought I'd see it, he said to a coworker. See what the coworker asked. Management listening. Frank replied and smiled. The deposition calendar thickened. Mary spent mornings in windowless rooms and afternoons on factory floors. The contrast kept her steady. When opposing counsel tried again to frame her as disgruntled, she corrected him once and did not elaborate. When he suggested motive, she said, "Safety isn't a mood." The court reporter typed and did not look up. One evening, Mary found her brother waiting on her couch, coat-folded cane leaning against the armrest. I took the bus, he said, pleased. She made tea and sat with him. He looked around the apartment like he was memorizing it. You're busy, he said. Useful, she replied. He nodded. That suits you. Across the city, Thomas Reed met with his lawyer and finally listened. The lawyer spoke about exposure and optics and the cost of fighting memory with narrative. Thomas stared at the table and felt something hard give way. If I settle, he asked, what does it say? It says you chose certainty, the lawyer said. Thomas closed his eyes. He thought of certainty and how little of it he had ever had. He authorized a conversation. The offer came through counsel, quiet and conditional. Admission without admission. Penalties, oversight. Mary read it twice and set it aside. She did not decide. She forwarded it to Richard and Susan with a note. We review. Richard read it and did not smile. He called Mary instead. What do you think? Mary considered the pilot charts, the pause that had prevented a crack from becoming a failure, the workers who had started using the channel because someone answered. If it accelerates change and protects people, she said, it's worth considering. If it hides the lesson, it's not. Richard nodded, though she could not see him. Then we'll test it against that. The winter began to loosen. Snow softened into rain. Mary walked faster and carried less. The program expanded to 2 more plants. A woman in a hard hat stopped Mary in a hallway and said, "They fixed the lock." Mary smiled and said, "Good." At a community meeting, a man asked if the company was only acting because it had been caught. Richard answered himself, "We're acting because we learned," he said. The room held its breath and let it go. The judge scheduled a mediation date. Mary attended without speaking much. The room felt smaller than the courtroom, the air thicker. Thomas Reed entered and for the first time looked at Mary directly. His eyes searched for something. She did not offer it. When the mediator broke for lunch, Thomas asked to speak. Susan agreed to a hallway with glass walls. "I didn't set out to hurt anyone," Thomas said. Mary listened. She felt the familiar tug to explain, to soften. She resisted it. "Impact matters," she said. "Intent doesn't undo it." Thomas nodded once, a movement that cost him. He looked older than his years. "What do you want?" he asked. Mary thought of the faded label and the pause button and the word durable. "I want the work to outlast the case," she said. The settlement shifted, oversight strengthened, language sharpened, funds earmarked. When it was done, Mary felt no relief, only a steadying. The announcement came without fanfare. Settlement reached, reforms mandated, monitoring independent. The market moved on, the city moved on. At Harrington Industries, the next board meeting opened with a report Mary delivered in 8 minutes. No adjectives, just facts. When she finished, Richard thanked her and moved to the next item. It felt right. That evening, Mary walked home under a sky washed clean. She stopped at the diner and ordered soup. Evelyn was not there. Mary smiled at the empty booth and ate slowly. Her phone buzzed. A message from Susan. "You did good work," Mary replied. "We did." She reached her apartment and found a small package at the door. Inside was a watch, simple and durable, no shine. A note in her brother's handwriting. "For timing your pauses." She laughed and strapped it on. Later, Richard stood in the hallway one more time, coat over his arm. "We're announcing your role publicly," he said. "Tomorrow." Mary leaned against the doorframe. "Use my name," she said. "Not my story." Richard nodded. "Agreed." After he left, Mary stood at the window and watched the city breathe. The trial might still come, or it might not. The work would. She felt the weight settle into something like purpose. Not loud, not heroic, just present. Her phone buzzed again, a final message for the night. From Frank. Guardrail held. Mary typed back. "Good," and set the phone down, ready for morning. The announcement went live at 9 in the morning. Quiet and clean, a single page on the company site, mirrored by a brief wire note that traveled faster than intention. Mary Collins appointed Director of Safety and Ethics. The words felt heavier on the screen than they ever had in her hands. She read it once, closed the tab, and stood. The day was waiting. At Harrington Industries, the lobby filled with the ordinary rhythm of arrivals. Shoes scuffed. Coats shook off rain. Mary entered through the main doors, this time badge steady at her chest, her name printed without flourish. A few heads turned. Most did not. That was fine. Real change rarely announced itself with applause. In the first meeting, she did not stand at the head of the table. She sat among supervisors and stewards and opened a binder that smelled of ink and paper. She spoke about authority to pause work and the obligation to explain why. She spoke about records that outlasted reputations. She spoke about the cost of silence and the value of being boring. When someone tried to hurry her, she slowed. The room followed. By midday, the pilot charts were replaced with a calendar. Walkdowns scheduled, trainings booked, reviews set with time enough to breathe. Mary signed the page and slid it across to Richard Harrington. He signed beneath her name without comment. The ink dried. The work moved forward. Outside, the city shifted into a brighter season. Snowmelt traced the gutters. Buses hissed and pulled away. At a plant 2 states over, a supervisor hit the pause and waited. A vibration became a loose fitting instead of a headline. A crew finished their shift and went home without a story to tell. That was the point. In the afternoon, Mary sat with counsel and auditors one last time. The settlement language was final. Now oversight clear, funding protected. No adjectives, no victory laps. Susan Hale closed her folder and smiled, tired and satisfied. "You kept it clean," she said. Mary nodded. "We kept it useful." At a plant cafeteria, Frank stood with a cup of coffee and watched a new notice go up. He read it twice, then once more. He nodded to no one and went back to work. Thomas Reed watched the same notice on his screen and felt the finality settle. He closed the laptop and looked out a window that did not open. He thought of the watch he used to wear and did not reach for it. He would learn to live with the record. Mary left the building late and walked home. The rain had stopped. The sidewalks shone. She thought of the hallway where she had been told to clear her locker in 10 minutes and felt no heat rise, no rush of old shame. The memory had weight, but it no longer owned her. At her apartment, she cooked and labeled containers for her brother's freezer. He arrived with a grocery bag and a grin. They ate and talked about small things that mattered. He watched her wash dishes and said, "You look settled." She smiled. "I feel placed." Later, a knock sounded softer than it once had been. Richard Harrington stood in the hall without a coat, rain darkening his shoulders. He did not step inside. The board approved the budget, he said, and the reporting line, and the pause authority company-wide. Mary leaned against the doorframe. "Good." "They asked me what changed," Richard added. Mary waited. "I told them we listened," he said. She nodded. "Keep doing that." He smiled small and real and left. The next morning, Mary stood before a room of workers at the Indiana plant. The hum of machines waited behind the walls. She spoke about the pause and the process, and the promise that no one would be punished for choosing people over speed. She spoke without flourish. When she finished, she stepped aside and listened. The questions came. She answered. The room loosened. In the back, a woman held up her phone and took a photo not of Mary, but of the slide that read, "Speak up. Protected. Always." She lowered the phone and nodded to herself. Weeks passed. The work became routine. Reports came in and were answered. Training cycles repeated. A lock stuck and was fixed. A checklist confused and was rewritten. Mary learned which days demanded steel and which asked for patience. She wore the simple watch her brother had given her and timed her pauses. One evening she returned to the diner where it had begun. The smell was the same. The booth by the wall was empty. She ordered soup and ate slowly. She thought of Evelyn Brooks and the quiet courage of watching patterns. She raised her mug to the empty seat and smiled. At home, Mary opened the old folder Evelyn had given her and placed it on a shelf beside the new binder. Past and present, touching without colliding. She stood at the window and watched the city breathe the lights like promises kept small and steady. The story moved on as stories do. Headlines faded. The work remained. Mary did not feel like a symbol. She felt like a steward. That was enough. If this journey meant something to you, stay with us. Like and subscribe and leave a comment with 3 words, "Speak Up Always."